924, Big 550, KTRS, the board meeting in session. Tony Messenger sits atop his purse as the editorial page editor via Skype. You can watch the whole show, we should say, at stltoday.com, and you can also watch it at ktrs.com, and then we'll post all of this and send it out via Facebook and Twitter and all that type of stuff. So Tony Messenger's here, editorial page editor of the Post. Jane Duker is here, and House Majority Leader John Diehl, Speaker in waiting John Diehl. The legislative session in session, Mr. John Diehl. Everybody wants to know your thoughts as we start as a Speaker in waiting. What are your thoughts as this legislative session gets underway?
We kicked off yesterday. Constitutionally, the session started. So each this House and the Senate both gavelled in, and right now we're in the process of bills being filed, and they get referred to committee. So it'll be a couple weeks before substantive bills get to the floor that I can actually talk about that get out of committee. But I think you're going to see on both sides of the aisle a general consensus that gets built around a couple of themes. One, I think you're going to see another tax cut that gets out of both bodies and on the governor's desk. I don't know exactly what that's going to look like yet, whether it's corporate or income tax cuts, but I think you're going to see a broad-based tax cut that makes it across. I think you're going to see some labor reform, whether it's right to work that gets put on the ballot, or whether it's a paycheck protection type of bill that gets put on the governor's desk. I think you're going to see some sort of energy policy that comes through. We need to deal with energy infrastructure in the state. I know the speaker's indicated that that's a priority, and I believe that's also a priority for the president pro tem on the Senate side to try to get some sort of resolution.
Right. Any word on Medicare expansion? What's going on?
Not a whole lot of talk about that yesterday. I know there's, each of the bodies has different groups that are looking at that. I think at least on the House side, and I believe on the Senate side also, I think first we're going to take a look at how do you reform Medicaid, what type of platform should it look like going forward, whether that's a managed care model for the entire state. Right now, probably, Jane probably knows the exact number. I think it's about 60% of the state is on a managed care model for the TANF population. I think one thing we could look at is that there's a managed care for the entire state because it seems to have worked fairly well. And also whether or not we set up maybe a pilot managed care, whether it's a provider managed or whether it's an outside source managed care program for the age blind and disabled population to see how that works, and then based upon that platform you can start having a discussion on what happens in the federal level. That's the problem that we have right now is I don't think anyone at the state level feels comfortable with what's happening at the federal level on health care.
Tony Messenger.
What a wonderful just example of what is wrong with the Missouri legislature and the Missouri Republican Party right now, when the first two things that John Diehl and the current speaker, Tim Jones, want to talk about are cutting money from schools, which is what's going to happen if there's a tax cut, and hurting workers, taking money away from workers and making income inequality even worse. And what I find so fascinating about the fact that they held a big right to work rally yesterday, because that's what the folks at ALEC want them to do, is this is just a couple of weeks after they stood side by side with their union brothers up at Boeing to say, hey, let's bring these union jobs to Missouri. And now they want to say, let's attack those union jobs. It's ridiculous. Right to work is not going to happen in this state. It's a waste of time. A tax cut is only going to hurt education, and anybody who tries to push it can't say that they're pro schools. They're doing the exact wrong things. Money for schools, fix the school transfer situation, and pass Medicaid expansion. That's how you get the economy going.
I'll respond to that. If we're going to say we're not going to do right to work because it's not going to happen, Medicaid expansion's not going to happen this year either, so let's not talk about it. Is that a fair trade?
No, because it is going to happen, and it should happen.
No, you're talking about what should and what is, okay? It's probably, do you really believe that the Missouri Senate and the Missouri House
For those listening online,
Wow.
Tony Messenger is
Now there are signs.
he's holding up a sign. John is wrong again.
When I'm the calm
You
one in the
notice how
room,
he's doing
we have
that
a problem.
behind a Skype here, so I can't go pow, one of those kind of things.
That's called passive aggressive, I believe.
It
that's
might
right.
be.
Tony, John Diehl has the floor.
Well, and also too, I believe that you cut tax rates, you increase tax collections. It's been proven over and over and over again. So cutting a tax rate, putting money back in people's pockets, the choice is simple. Okay, the dollar that we're talking about on a tax cut, is it best spent by the person who earned that dollar, or is it best spent by a government bureaucrat in Jefferson City? I'll bet on the small business owner and the person who earned that dollar every single day.
I want to get to Jane. I want to clarify something you said earlier. Did you say that Medicaid expansion is not going to happen?
Oh, I think it's highly unlikely. So I'm holding Tony's standard. Tony said we shouldn't be wasting our time on talking right to work because it's not going to pass. Well, okay, then why are we even going to talk about Medicaid expansion either? Because that's probably not going to pass this year.
What about the school transfer issue? Is there enough something going on there where you might get over the goal line?
I think there's going to be a lot of discussion on that this year. I know, when Senator Schmidt was here last week,
Right.
he indicated that, there were some senators getting together on that. I know on our side of the aisle, that on our side of the building, there's also people that are interested in addressing that. That the problem with education bills is they tend to pile on with a lot of different things, but I think there is enough interest where there's going to be a serious discussion.
Jane Duker.
Well, as far as the education issue, I do think there's going to be a tremendous amount of debate. I think there's going to be all kinds of issues ranging from the transfer issue to, accreditation and to funding. Obviously the governor is proposing an increase for spending for the schools, and I expect the state of the state to include that. I expect the governor to come out and talk about anti-worker legislation. I think he's going to remain firm on that. I think so that'll be interesting to see the foil that comes out during State of the State. I think there are some Democrats who are willing to talk about tax reform and whatnot, but it's not going to be what happened last year. And I think so if anything happens, it's going to be a much further scaled down version, and so I think it looks like much of a repeat from last year. So
Tony?
same issues.
I think there's also one other really interesting dynamic going on here, and that's the budget. Okay, that this is going to be the first year in over a decade that we're not budgeting against a consensus revenue number. Okay, so typically the way
I remember
Hold
that.
on a second. For the layman out there.
I was just going to say, typically
Yes.
what happens is the House budget staff, Senate budget staff, and governor's budget staff get together and agree on what we think the dollar amount is that's going to come in for the next fiscal year.
Got it.
Okay, so then the governor submits a budget. We may say, okay, we're taking things out of this pot and putting
But you
it in
all
this
agree
pot.
on a number.
We all
first.
agree on a net number.
Right.
The governor this year, we agreed, the staff all agreed that the consensus revenue number was going to go up by about $700 million over what it was the year before. So it got up to the governor's staff, and they decided, no, it needs to be $200 million higher because he wants us to budget as high as possible so he has the power of withholds as you go through the system. And he walked out of the consensus revenue numbers.
So you don't have a consensus.
We don't have a consensus revenue number. So when the governor comes in, I think the last time this happened was
when I was in the governor's
Holden was
office.
governor.
When
The first
Holden was
time.
trying to stick it to the people.
Well, no, actually, it's the exact reverse because in the General Assembly then
We
was
were
the
perfect.
one. No, but the General Assembly back then was the one that walked away from the consensus revenue because revenue numbers were falling. So they wanted to stick it to Holden and make Holden withhold the money. So when revenues are going down, the legislature wants to budget higher and force the governor into the nasty choices. Now that revenue's going up, the governor's like, well, wow, this is an interesting dynamic. I'm going to try to get the revenue numbers up and force the legislature to, lower my estimates and lower my appropriations.
And the governor's going around promising everything to everybody. He went to the university systems and said, no, I'm promising you all this money. You have to commit to me that there's no tuition increases. Well, they didn't do that, to their credit, because they know there's a process that you have to go through on this.
Right.
He's gone and promised state mental hospital that he wants to bond out now instead of using the $700 million that we have this year. He's promised to fully fund the foundation for it. So what we're going to see in about a week and a half is a budget submitted by the governor that's going to be pretty meaningless. It's going to have a whole bunch of fluff in it, and the real work's going to start in the budget committees in late January.
Tony Messenger, you'll have the last comment on this topic. Take it away.
You know, Jane Duker said something interesting. She said, unfortunately, it looks a whole lot like last year. And while I try to be an optimist and hold out hope that they will find a way to deal with the school transfer issue, find a way to deal with Medicaid expansion, find a way to pass some ethics reform, it's an election year for most of the folks in that Capitol. And I suspect it's going to be a whole lot like last year. And when you start off talking about right to work, and when you start off with John's counterpart in the Senate saying the first thing the Senate's going to do is deal with an unconstitutional gun bill, then I don't have a whole lot of hope that there's going to be some success in the Missouri Capitol this year.
That is Tony Messenger, John Diehl, Speaker of the House in waiting, House Majority Leader, also Jane Duker. The board meeting continues after this on the Big 550.